My name is Mia. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in corporate governance and compliance in Toronto. On paper, my role has always sounded structured and analytical: risk reports, audit trails, internal reviews. In reality, my job has been about people, about watching what they do when they believe no one important is looking. Most people don't consider me threatening. I'm not the loudest person in the room. I don't interrupt. I don't perform confidence. I practice it quietly. Colleagues have described me as steady, reliable, pleasant. Those are compliments, I suppose. But they're also labels that make it easy to underestimate someone. For 3 years, I sat beside the same coworker. We shared deadlines, inside jokes about endless board decks, and the soft rituals of proximity: coffee refills, borrowed pens, synchronized sighs during quarterly reviews. Trust, when built through repetition, feels almost automatic. You don't question it. You assume it's mutual. And then one day I realized something that shifted everything. The colleague who sat beside me for 3 years wasn't just working alongside me. She was reporting me. Not formally, not in any documented performance review process. Quietly, consistently, directly to senior leadership. Every hesitation I voiced, every strategic suggestion I tested aloud, every vulnerability I shared in passing, all of it had been traveling upward, to the board. When I first understood it, there was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, no cinematic betrayal, just a moment of stillness. A single internal recalibration where the past 3 years rearranged themselves in my mind, like a puzzle finally locking into place. This story isn't about revenge, and it's not about exposing someone as a villain. It's about perception, power, silence. And what happens when you realize the version of you someone has been describing to leadership isn't the version you intended to present. Over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through the emotional landscape of that realization. How small moments, comments, glances, oddly specific feedback from executives began to form a pattern. How I moved from confusion to clarity, and how I chose to respond without spectacle. Because here's the truth: when someone studies you in order to report you, they assume you're not studying them back. I want to tell this honestly, without exaggeration, without turning anyone into a caricature. Office dynamics are rarely dramatic in the way movies portray them. They're subtle, they're quiet, they live in email phrasing and meeting summaries, in who gets credit, in who gets framed, and in who gets watched. This is the story of how I discovered that the person closest to me at work was also the closest link between me and the people who controlled my future there. It's about what that realization cost me and what it unexpectedly gave me. Have you ever looked back at a relationship and suddenly seen it from an entirely different angle? In the office, I was predictable. That's not an insult. It's simply the role I occupied. I arrived at 8:15 every morning, not because anyone required it, but because I preferred the silence before the rest of the floor filled with conversation and urgency. I reviewed board summaries before the executives did. I flagged discrepancies before they became talking points. When someone needed historical context on a policy decision from 2 years ago, I was the person they asked. To leadership, I was thorough. To peers, I was calm. To my direct manager, I was low maintenance. What none of those words captured was how carefully I observed everything. I sat beside Claire for 3 years. She joined the firm a few months after I did. Confident, articulate, socially fluent in a way I've never tried to be. Where I was deliberate, she was fluid. Where I paused, she filled space. People warmed to her quickly. I did too. We became work-adjacent friends, not the kind who text late at night, but the kind who debrief after tense meetings, the kind who share snacks during audit week, the kind who subtly defend each other in conversations when one of us is absent. At least, that's what I believed we were doing. From the outside, I imagine we looked balanced. She handled presentation delivery. I handled structural content. She volunteered for cross-department committees. I preferred to stay close to core reporting. She joked with senior managers in elevators. I nodded politely and stepped off on my floor. If someone had described me back then, they would have said I was dependable but not ambitious, intelligent but not political, capable but not strategic in a visible way. I didn't correct that perception. There's a strange freedom in being underestimated. People reveal more around you. They speak candidly, assuming you're not calculating implications. They say things like, "You're not really interested in leadership, right? You like the analytical side." And I would smile softly and say, "I like understanding how things work," which was true. But it wasn't the full truth. What they didn't see was how often executives requested revisions specifically through me, how frequently board members referenced language I had drafted, how many late-night emails from the CFO began with, "Can you quietly review this before it goes wider?" Influence doesn't always come with a title. Sometimes it comes with access. Claire, sitting beside me, witnessed all of this. She saw the private pings on my screen. She heard the tone shifts when certain calls came in. She noticed when directors bypassed others and approached me directly for clarification. At the time, I interpreted her attention as curiosity, professional interest. Looking back, I understand it differently. But back then, I believed I was safe in my invisibility. I wasn't the office star. I wasn't the rising executive darling. I was the steady one, the reliable backbone, the woman who made sure the numbers aligned and the narrative held together. There's comfort in being seen as non-threatening. No one guards themselves around you. No one imagines you're a variable in their strategy. And no one warns you when you quietly become part of someone else's. If you had walked past our desks during those 3 years, you would have seen two women working in parallel, occasionally laughing, occasionally whispering, typing in synchronized rhythm before board deadlines. You would not have seen power dynamics shifting in subtle increments. You would not have noticed how often Claire asked, "What do you think leadership really wants here?" in a tone that seemed casual, but lingered a little too long. At the time, I answered freely, because I thought I was speaking to a colleague, not an audience, not a channel. Just a woman sitting beside me, sharing the same fluorescent light and the same performance review cycle. It took me 3 years to realize that who I thought I was to them and who I actually was in their internal conversations were not the same person. The first cut didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like confusion. It happened during a quarterly board preparation cycle, one of those weeks when the entire governance team moves in quiet urgency. Slides revised at midnight, footnotes triple-checked, language softened just enough to sound accountable but not alarming. Claire and I were finalizing a risk summary draft. I remember leaning slightly toward her screen and saying, almost absent-mindedly, "We should be careful with how we phrase the liquidity exposure section. If the board reads this too literally, they'll escalate unnecessarily." It wasn't criticism. It was strategic caution, a nuance you only develop after watching the board react to certain trigger words over time. Claire nodded. "So you think we should downplay it?" "Not downplay," I corrected gently. "Contextualize." PM. She smiled. "You're always thinking 3 moves ahead." It sounded like admiration. 2 days later, I was in a pre-board call with the CFO and 2 directors. Claire wasn't present. She wasn't senior enough for that meeting yet. We were reviewing final slides when one of the directors paused. "Mia," he said, tone neutral. "I understand there was some internal discussion about opening the liquidity language. I want to be clear, we don't dilute risk disclosures to manage reactions." The room went quiet. I felt something unfamiliar then. Not panic, not anger. Displacement. I hadn't softened anything. I had reframed a paragraph to clarify exposure thresholds. The final version was accurate, transparent, measured. "I agree," I replied calmly. The intent was clarity, not dilution. The numbers remain unchanged. The phrasing aligns with prior quarters to maintain comparability. The CFO moved the meeting forward quickly. No further probing, no visible reprimand. But the seed had been planted. After the call, I returned to my desk. Claire glanced at me. "How did it go?" "Fine," I said. She tilted her head. "You look reflective." I considered telling her about the comment. Instead, I simply asked, "Did anyone ask you about the liquidity language?" She hesitated for half a second, just long enough to register. "Oh," she said lightly. "I mentioned during my one-on-one that we debated wording. I thought it showed how thorough we were." Debated. The word felt heavier than it should have. "I see," I replied. And that was it. No confrontation, no accusation. On the surface, it was harmless. Sharing collaborative discussion with leadership isn't unusual. In many teams, it's encouraged. But something about the framing unsettled me, because in that board call, it hadn't sounded like collaboration. It had sounded like I was the one proposing dilution. The first small cut is rarely dramatic. It's a misalignment, a slight distortion, a moment where you sense the version of you being described elsewhere isn't entirely accurate. That afternoon, I opened my black leather notebook for the first time with a different intention. I wrote the date. I summarized the board comment verbatim, as best as memory allowed, and then I wrote one line beneath it. Language shifted between rooms. I didn't write Claire's name. I didn't assign blame. I simply documented the pattern. For weeks afterward, nothing overt happened. Claire remained warm, friendly, collaborative. She brought me tea when I stayed late. She included me in side conversations about process improvements. But occasionally, leadership feedback would contain oddly specific phrasing, phrases I had used casually beside her. Concerns I had voiced informally, later resurfacing as questions raised about Mia's risk tolerance. Risk tolerance. It was almost impressive, the subtlety. No direct criticism, no formal warning, just a slow shaping of narrative. The next time it happened, I didn't feel confusion. I felt awareness, not suspicion, awareness. Because patterns once noticed become difficult to ignore. And the hardest part wasn't that someone might be sharing my comments upward. It was realizing I had been speaking without understanding the full audience. Trust, I learned that quarter, isn't broken in a single act. It's thinned, gradually, until one day you realize you've been standing alone in conversations you thought were shared. Looking back, that board call was the first signal. Soft enough to dismiss, sharp enough to remember. And I remembered it, quietly. After the liquidity incident, nothing visibly changed. No one pulled me into a corrective meeting. My performance reviews remained strong. My manager still described me as technically exceptional. If anything, the surface of my professional life remained intact. And that's what made it so easy to rationalize what was happening. The second instance came a month later. Claire and I were preparing a summary on internal audit delays. It was a politically sensitive topic because the delays weren't caused by governance. They were caused by executive indecision. I remember leaning back in my chair and saying quietly, if we keep absorbing timeline blame, leadership won't feel pressure to fix the bottleneck. It was a strategic observation, not a complaint. Claire nodded thoughtfully. So you think we should push back? I think we should clarify ownership, I said. Gently. 2 weeks later, my manager scheduled a quick alignment chat. That phrase always sounds harmless. He closed the door, smiled politely, and said, I've been hearing that you might be feeling frustrated about leadership responsiveness. I just want to make sure that sentiment isn't influencing how you're positioning audit updates. Hearing that word again. I'm not frustrated, I said calmly. I'm attentive to accountability structures. He laughed lightly. Of course, I know how precise you are. Just making sure tone doesn't get misinterpreted. Misinterpreted. The pattern was becoming more defined. Comments I made analytically were reappearing emotionally reframed. I walked back to my desk slowly. Claire glanced at me. Everything okay? Yes, I said, and I meant it. I wasn't upset. I was calibrating. There's a phase in these dynamics where you try to defend the other person in your own mind. You tell yourself, she didn't mean it that way. Leadership probably asked her directly. Maybe I'm overanalyzing. We normalize small distortions because acknowledging them feels disproportionate. It feels paranoid. And I have always valued rationality over reaction. So I adjusted, not dramatically, but subtly. I shared less speculation aloud. I stopped testing unfinished thoughts beside her. I responded more often with neutral phrases like, let's see how leadership wants to position that. She noticed. You've been quieter lately, she said one afternoon, almost teasing. Busy, I replied. But she began probing more. What do you really think about the restructuring? Off the record, do you trust the new VP? If you were on the board, would you approve this? The questions were framed as intimacy, as insider bonding. And I answered carefully, because part of me still wanted to believe I was mistaken, that this wasn't deliberate, that it was simply workplace noise. But the third small cut was harder to ignore. During mid-year feedback, my manager said something that didn't align with any documented conversation we'd had. Some senior leaders feel you might not be fully aligned with long-term strategic vision, he said gently. I felt stillness spread through me. Can you give an example? I asked. He hesitated. It's more a perception, a sense that you question direction rather than champion it. Question direction. I have built my entire career on asking precise questions. It's the core of compliance work. But suddenly, inquiry was being reframed as resistance. And I knew exactly where that perception had likely originated. Not because Claire was openly critical. Not because she ever undermined me publicly. but because she was the only consistent audience to my unfiltered thoughts. When I left that meeting, I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity hardening. This wasn't accidental sharing anymore. It was narrative shaping. And what disturbed me most wasn't the fact that she was reporting upward. It was how skillfully she preserved her warmth while doing it. She still laughed at my dry jokes, still offered to grab coffee, still leaned in when I spoke. The coexistence of friendliness and quiet exposure created cognitive dissonance. It made it difficult to anchor any reaction. So I did what high-functioning professionals often do when faced with subtle disrespect. I normalized it. I told myself, this is politics. Everyone manages perception. Maybe she's just being strategic. I didn't confront her. I didn't withdraw completely. I simply became more deliberate. But internally, something shifted. A small fracture between instinct and acceptance. Because when someone repeatedly reframes your competence as emotional volatility, when your analytical caution becomes risk aversion, when your thoughtful questions become lack of alignment, you start to understand that your silence is being interpreted in rooms you're not in. And you have two options. Continue speaking freely and hope interpretation corrects itself, or recognize that someone is translating you and adjust accordingly. By the end of that quarter, I stopped wondering whether information was traveling upward. I began asking a different question. Why? The moment you realize you're being interpreted by someone else, you begin to notice the role you've been placed in. Not the title on your email signature, the role in the narrative. By the third year sitting beside Claire, I could almost predict how I would be described in leadership conversations. Mia is incredibly thorough. She's detail-oriented. She prefers stability. She's cautious. None of those statements were false, but they were incomplete. And incompleteness, repeated often enough, becomes identity. One afternoon, we were preparing slides for a strategic planning session. Claire was energized, animated, already rehearsing how she would present certain sections. You know, she said casually, you're perfect for this team because you're not political. I glanced at her. Not political? She shrugged, smiling. I mean that as a compliment. You don't angle for visibility. You just do the work. I recognized the framing immediately. In her version of the story, she was the visible driver. I was the reliable engine. Useful, necessary, replaceable. I'm very aware of visibility, I said gently. She laughed. You don't care about it. That was the moment I understood something clearly. They didn't think I wanted more. They thought I was content being the stabilizer, the background constant, the woman who would carry weight without asking for credit. And to be fair, I had allowed that perception. I rarely volunteered for spotlight roles. I declined panel invitations. I redirected praise toward the team. Not because I lacked ambition, but because I valued control over attention. Attention is unpredictable. Control is precise. But perception doesn't care about intention. It responds to patterns. And the pattern I had created was this. Mia is dependable. Mia is intelligent. Mia will not disrupt hierarchy. In leadership psychology, that translates to safety. And safety is rarely promoted beyond its assigned boundary. I began replaying subtle interactions in my mind. The time the VP asked Claire to give her take on a governance shift, when I had drafted the framework. The moment in a meeting when a director said, Claire mentioned you had some concerns, instead of asking me directly. The phrasing in performance reviews. Mia thrives in supportive roles. Supportive. The role had been written, and I had been cast without audition. But here's the part that took me longer to admit. Claire didn't invent that role. She amplified it, because it served her narrative too. In contrast to a cautious analyst, she became the confident strategist. In contrast to risk-aware, she became growth-oriented. In contrast to quiet, she became executive presence. It was an elegant pairing, and I had unknowingly participated in it. There's a specific kind of invisibility that doesn't feel oppressive. It feels professional, responsible, mature. You tell yourself that you don't need recognition. That impact matters more than applause. But when someone begins using your restraint to define your limits, something changes. I didn't feel resentment. I felt miscast. One evening, long after most of the floor had emptied, I stayed at my desk reviewing archived board minutes from previous years. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted context. Patterns. Who advanced? Who plateaued? Who left? And I noticed something unsettling. The people who rose weren't necessarily the most competent. They were the most clearly framed. Leadership needs narrative simplicity, and I had allowed mine to become too small. The next morning, Claire leaned over and said, "The board really values that you're not emotionally reactive. It makes them comfortable." Comfortable. It was meant as praise. But I heard something else. Containable. That was the role. Reliable, intelligent, safe, not threatening, not ascending, and certainly not strategic in ways that required guarding against. That's when I understood the deeper layer of what had been happening for 3 years. It wasn't just that Claire was reporting my comments. She was curating my image. And I had been quiet enough to let her. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me alert. Because once you understand the role you've been assigned, you can decide whether to keep playing it or rewrite it silently. There wasn't a dramatic revelation. No accidental forwarded email. No overheard phone call. No confession. The shift happened on a Tuesday afternoon in a room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and printer toner. It was a closed-door strategy session with 3 senior leaders and 2 directors. Claire had been invited this time, her first appearance in a room at that level, for a full strategic discussion. I wasn't surprised. She had positioned herself well over the past year. What I wasn't prepared for was the tone. We were discussing a restructuring proposal, one that would subtly consolidate governance oversight under a new executive function. On paper, it sounded efficient. In practice, it diluted independence. I listened carefully as the VP spoke. Then one of the directors turned to Claire. "You've been close to the team dynamics. How do you think Mia will respond to this change? Not how will the team respond? Not what are the operational risks? How will Mia respond?" The question was clinical, predictive, as if I were a variable in a model. Claire didn't hesitate. "She values structure," she said smoothly. "If the rationale is framed around long-term stability, she'll align. Her concern is usually risk optics, not resistance." There it was. Packaged, interpreted, delivered. I watched her as she spoke, not with anger, but with clarity. She wasn't attacking me, she was analyzing me. And in that moment, I realized something far more significant than gossip or misrepresentation. She had been studying me, not casually, not accidentally, systematically. The board wasn't asking her what I said. They were asking her who I was. And she was answering. I felt no immediate surge of emotion, no heat rising in my chest. Instead, I felt something settle, a quiet internal recalibration. For 3 years, I had believed we were colleagues navigating the same terrain. In reality, she had positioned herself as interpreter between me and power. After the meeting, we walked back toward our desks together. "That went well," she said lightly. "It was informative," I replied. Fancy," she smiled. "They really trust your consistency." Consistency, another word that can be shaped. I sat down at my desk and opened my black notebook. Not hurriedly, not dramatically, just deliberately. I wrote the date. Then I wrote, "Today they didn't ask me who I am. They asked her." That was the shift. Not anger, not betrayal. Clarity. Because once someone becomes the narrator of your professional identity in rooms you're not fully present in, you no longer have a perception problem. You have a control problem. And control, unlike emotion, can be reclaimed. That evening, instead of going home immediately, I stayed behind and reviewed the governance reporting hierarchy. Access points, communication channels, informal influence lines. Not to retaliate. To understand. If Claire had been reporting upward for 3 years, she wasn't doing it recklessly. She was doing it strategically. She had built credibility by being useful, by offering insight into team dynamics, including mine. I asked myself a difficult question. Had she been malicious or simply ambitious? The answer didn't change what mattered. Information had been flowing in one direction, without my awareness. And that day, sitting in that conference room, hearing myself described like a predictable algorithm, I made a quiet decision. I would no longer be predictable, not emotionally, strategically. Silence, I realized, is neutral only when unobserved. When someone is mapping your reactions, silence becomes data. So I stopped giving free data. I didn't confront her. I didn't withdraw visibly. I simply began speaking as if every word might travel further than the desk beside me, because it probably would. And the most powerful realization of that Tuesday wasn't that Claire had been reporting me. It was that I had been transparent in ways that made reporting effortless. That would not continue. The shift wasn't loud. It was structural, inside me. From that day forward, I didn't think of Claire as my colleague. I thought of her as a lens, and I adjusted what I allowed to pass through it. After that Tuesday, I didn't change my behavior dramatically. That would have been obvious. Instead, I changed its architecture. The difference between unconscious silence and deliberate silence is almost invisible from the outside. Both look calm, both look measured, but internally, one is passive, and the other is strategic. I began treating every casual conversation at our shared desk as if it were a recorded briefing. Not tense, not guarded. precise. When Claire asked, "What do you really think about this restructuring?" I would respond, "I think clarity of mandate will determine its success. Neutral, analytical, unexploitable." If she pressed further, "But do you trust leadership's intentions?" I'd tilt my head slightly and say, "Trust follows transparency. We'll see." No emotional charge, no personal alignment disclosed. At first, she didn't notice. Then she did. "You've been very diplomatic lately," she observed one morning. I smiled lightly. I've always been diplomatic. She studied me for a moment, as if recalculating. The interesting thing about someone who's been gathering data on you is this. When the data stream slows, they feel it. Leadership feedback began shifting subtly too. Instead of comments like, "We hear you may have concerns," I started receiving direct questions in meetings. "Mia, what's your position on this?" That question had rarely been asked so directly before, and I answered calmly in the room, without having previewed my thoughts beside Claire first. Silence had changed the routing. When you stop providing commentary in the margins, people have to engage you at the source. Claire adjusted her tactics. She began sharing more of her own opinions first. "I actually think the board is overcorrecting," she'd say casually, watching my reaction. I would nod thoughtfully. Interesting perspective. That's all. No agreement, no opposition. Just space. Space is uncomfortable for someone who thrives on dialogue. One afternoon, she leaned closer than usual. "Are you upset with me?" she asked softly. The question was disarming. "No," I replied honestly. Because I wasn't upset. I was aware. She searched my face for something. Resentment, perhaps. Distance. What she found was composure. "You just seem different." "People evolve," I said gently. And that was the truth. The silence wasn't punishment. It was repositioning. In meetings, I began speaking slightly earlier than usual, not to dominate, but to establish authorship before narratives formed around me. I clarified my stances publicly, succinctly. I documented project rationales and shared summaries instead of hallway conversations. Not defensive, transparent. There's a difference. When silence is unconscious, it makes you easy to define. When silence is chosen, it makes you difficult to predict. Claire, I noticed, grew more animated in leadership settings. She filled space faster, offered interpretations more readily, sometimes even framed team sentiment without consulting the team first. The contrast was subtle but visible. And something interesting began happening. The board started asking follow-up questions directly to me when interpretations were offered on my behalf. "Mia, does that align with your view?" 3 years ago, that question might not have been asked. Now it was, because I had stopped outsourcing my voice, even informally. Claire wasn't wrong about one thing. I value structure. And I realized the structure I needed wasn't emotional confrontation. It was narrative containment. I didn't accuse her. I didn't expose her. I simply became less permeable. Silence, when mistaken for weakness, can be a powerful miscalculation. Because people who underestimate your restraint often reveal their strategy more openly. I watched carefully over the next few months. Patterns sharpened, moments surfaced, and while Claire may have believed I was retreating, I was documenting, preparing, not for revenge, for clarity. Because once you recognize that someone has been translating you for 3 years, you don't argue with the translator. You learn the language of the room yourself, and then you decide when to speak. When people think you've grown quieter, they rarely ask what you've grown more attentive to. They assumed I was retreating. I was in fact expanding. The first thing I did was audit my own footprint, not emotionally, structurally. I reviewed every major board deck from the past 3 years. Not just the final versions, but the metadata. Who edited what? When phrasing shifted. Which slides consistently carried my language, but were verbally introduced by someone else. Patterns emerged quickly. Claire often volunteered to walk leadership through governance updates that I had architected. Not in a deceptive way, she always acknowledged the team. But the nuance of authorship blurred over time. Presentation builds perception. Perception builds credibility. Credibility builds access. And access builds influence. It was elegant. I didn't resent it, I studied it. Next, I began tracking feedback language more precisely. Whenever a senior leader used phrasing that felt strangely familiar, terms I had once used casually beside Claire, I documented the context, dates, meetings, wording, not to build a case, to map flow. Within 3 months, the pattern was undeniable. My speculative thoughts, shared informally, would reappear upward, slightly reframed, usually detached from my original intent, not malicious distortions, optimized interpretations. I also began attending cross-functional meetings I had previously declined. Not loudly, just consistently. When invitations were optional, I showed up. Yeah. And I spoke early, briefly, intentionally. The goal wasn't visibility for ego, it was authorship. When I outlined governance risks directly in a forum, it removed the opportunity for someone else to summarize my position later. Claire noticed. "You've been everywhere lately," she said one afternoon, half amused. Broader context helps," I replied. She studied me carefully now, not suspicious, alert. Meanwhile, something else shifted behind the scenes. I had always had quiet access to board reporting systems. As part of compliance, I reviewed raw submissions before compilation. Historically, I treated that access as technical. Now I treated it as informational leverage, not to manipulate, to understand. I paid attention to who was advocating for which initiatives, which executives aligned consistently, which directors asked deeper questions. You cannot control narrative without understanding audience psychology. And for the first time, I stopped seeing leadership as a monolith. They weren't unified. They were individuals with priorities, fears, incentives. Claire had been offering them insight about me. I began offering them clarity about governance risk, directly. In one quarterly session, a director challenged a proposed oversight reduction. "Mia, you've worked closest to historical audit outcomes. What's your assessment?" I answered succinctly, referencing 3 prior cases, citing documented impact. No emotion, no hesitation. After the meeting, the same director emailed me privately. "Appreciate your direct framing today." Direct. That word lingered, because it meant something had shifted in perception. I also began strengthening alliances quietly, not through gossip or bonding, but through reliability. When another department needed regulatory interpretation, I responded quickly. When a project required cross-team alignment, I facilitated without fanfare. Influence compounds when it's consistent. Claire continued operating as she always had, socially agile, interpretive, conversational. But something subtle changed in how leadership interacted with her. They began verifying, not distrustfully, curiously. If she framed a team sentiment, someone would say, "Let's confirm that in the room next week." Verification reduces reliance. Reliance reduces singular influence. She wasn't losing credibility, but she was no longer the sole lens. What she never noticed was that I wasn't competing with her. I was decentralizing her role. There's a difference. Competition is visible. Structural adjustment is not. I also adjusted something internally. For years, my emotional wound, the fear of being misrepresented, had made me cautious. It made me careful with confrontation, careful with ambition. But that wound had also given me a strength, pattern recognition. When you grow up worried about being misunderstood, you become exquisitely sensitive to narrative shifts. I stopped seeing that as vulnerability. It was leverage. By the end of that year, my name appeared more frequently in formal summaries, not as a supportive contributor, but as lead architect, a primary analyst, was governance advisor. Titles hadn't changed. Positioning had. Claire still sat beside me, still warm, still perceptive. But the data stream she once relied on had narrowed, and in its place something else was forming. Clarity. Because the more I documented, the more one realization solidified. She hadn't just been reporting me. She had been building strategic capital from proximity. And now, I understood the currency. The confirmation didn't come in an explosion. It came in a spreadsheet. Late on a Thursday evening, I was reviewing archival governance submissions ahead of an upcoming external audit. Most people had left. The office lighting had shifted to its dimmed after-hours mode. Everything softer, quieter. I was cross-referencing timestamp histories when I noticed something unusual. Certain summary notes submitted to the executive pre-read folder, notes that framed team sentiment or risk posture alignment, had been uploaded under Claire's credentials. That wasn't strange by itself. She often assisted with compilation. What was strange was the content. The summaries included interpretive commentary about internal dynamics, about hesitation within governance, about concerns regarding strategic acceleration. The phrasing was clinical and deeply familiar, because pieces of it had originated in conversations beside me months earlier. Not copied verbatim, synthesized, structured, positioned. I scrolled back further. There were at least 9 separate submissions over the past 2 years, where narrative framing of my perspective appeared indirectly, under broader team analysis. In none of them was I quoted directly, but the characterization was consistent. Mia, analytical, cautious, values structural integrity, hesitant on aggressive pivots. Again, none of it false, but none of it neutral either. I sat back slowly in my chair. For a moment, I didn't feel anger. I felt admiration. It was meticulous. She hadn't slandered me, she hadn't fabricated concerns. She had curated emphasis. And emphasis shapes perception more effectively than accusation ever could. That was the private reveal, not that she had been gossiping, not that she had betrayed secrets, but that she had positioned herself as interpreter of team psychology, using proximity to generate insight currency. And I had been her most consistent data source. I closed the spreadsheet and opened my notebook. I didn't write emotionally, I documented facts. Dates of submissions, language parallels, timing relative to leadership feedback. Then I asked myself a question that mattered more than exposure. What does this give me? Not leverage in the sense of blackmail, leverage in understanding. Claire wasn't attacking me. She was building a case for her strategic value. By showing leadership, she understood internal sentiment, especially mine, which meant something important. Leadership had been relying on her interpretation because they lacked direct clarity from me. That wasn't a betrayal problem. It was an access gap. And gaps can be closed. I realized something else that night. In none of the documents did she recommend against me. She simply positioned me as stable infrastructure, which made her look dynamic by contrast. It was comparative influence, elegant, controlled. The revelation didn't create panic. It created stillness. Because once you see the full architecture, emotion becomes inefficient. You move into design. The next morning, I behaved exactly as usual. I greeted her. We reviewed slides. We shared a quiet joke about the printer jamming. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. I no longer wondered if information was flowing upward. I had seen the channel. And more importantly, I had seen its limitations. Her influence depended on interpretation. Interpretation depends on distance. If I reduce the distance between myself and leadership, without aggression, without theatrics, the interpretive layer would weaken naturally. No confrontation required. That was the power of the private reveal. It gave me clarity without spectacle. There is a particular calm that comes from understanding someone's strategy fully. It removes paranoia. It removes self-doubt. It replaces both with precision. And precision is quiet. That evening, I closed my notebook and wrote a single line. She needed to narrate me because I wasn't narrating myself. That would change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but irreversibly. Because now I wasn't operating on instinct. I was operating on knowledge. And knowledge, when held quietly, is a form of dominance. Once you understand the full structure of something, you arrive at a fork. Not emotional, strategic. After discovering the submission patterns, I gave myself 2 weeks before deciding anything. Not because I was uncertain, but because clarity requires space to settle. During those 2 weeks, I observed without interference. Claire continued her rhythm. Summaries, interpretations, selective insights. Leadership continued relying on her framing in subtle ways. Not excessively, not blindly, but habitually. And I evaluated my options. Option 1, confront her privately. It would be direct, clean, possibly cathartic. I've noticed you've been characterizing my views upward. What would she say? She would likely explain, justify, reframe it as collaborative synthesis. She might even apologize if confronted with documentation. But confrontation would accomplish one thing only. It would inform her that I had mapped the system. And once someone knows you see the system, they adjust it. I didn't want her adjusting. I wanted structural realignment. Option 2, escalate formally. I had documentation, submission timestamps, language parallels. If I wanted to, I could raise concerns about interpretive overreach in governance reporting. But what would that make me? Defensive, reactive, possibly territorial. There had been no policy violation, no misconduct, only positioning. Escalation without ethical breach is political suicide. I ruled it out immediately. Option 3, do nothing. Continue adjusting quietly. Let influence rebalance gradually. Safe, slow, but reversible. Because if I ever became complacent again, the pattern could return. And then there was option 4, the irreversible one. Remove the interpretive layer entirely, not by attacking it, by outgrowing it. I began thinking beyond my current role. For 3 years, I had operated inside governance reporting, but I had visibility across departments. I understood operational risk patterns better than most directors. What if I repositioned not as a team analyst, but as a cross-functional governance strategist? That would require something significant. A formal proposal to restructure oversight architecture under an independent advisory function, one that reported directly to the board, not through executive intermediaries. It wasn't radical. It was aligned with best practice models in larger firms. But in our company, it would be transformative, because it would shift narrative ownership from informal interpretation to formalized advisory. And I was uniquely positioned to draft it. The decision crystallized one evening while reviewing comparative regulatory frameworks. If I stayed in my current seat, I would always be subject to interpretation. If I changed the seat entirely, interpretation would become irrelevant. This wasn't revenge. It was elevation. The irreversible choice wasn't exposing Claire. It was stepping into a structure where she no longer had proximity advantage. And that meant risk. Because proposing governance restructuring to the board without executive sponsorship is delicate. It requires timing, data, political awareness. It requires calm. I prepared quietly. No one knew what I was drafting in the evenings. Not Claire, not my manager. I gathered external benchmarking data, documented inefficiencies caused by layered interpretation, highlighted regulatory trends favoring independent oversight channels. Every line was precise, evidence-backed, emotionless. When the document was finished, it wasn't a complaint. It was a blueprint, a proposal to establish an independent governance advisory track, one that would allow direct strategic input to the board on structural risk, separate from operational management summaries. If approved, it would create a role. Not necessarily for me, but one I was qualified to fill. And once that role existed, narrative would travel directly, not through adjacent desks. The decision wasn't impulsive. It was surgical. Because once I submitted that proposal, there would be no going back to invisible infrastructure. I would either rise or reposition elsewhere. That's what made it irreversible. The morning I finalized the document, I felt no adrenaline, only alignment. For 3 years, someone else had narrated who I was. Now I was defining the structure where narration occurred, and that difference changes everything. Once I decided to submit the proposal, everything became about sequencing, not speed. Sequence. There is a mistake people often make when they step into ambition after a period of underestimation. They move loudly. They announce intent. They gather allies prematurely. They test the waters in visible ways. I did none of that. First, I requested a routine one-on-one with a board liaison director under the pretense of benchmarking discussion. Not unusual in governance cycles. I framed it as research. I've been reviewing comparative oversight models in mid-size firms, I said calmly during our call. There's an emerging pattern toward independent advisory channels for structural risk. I didn't present my proposal yet. I asked questions. What's the board's long-term appetite for governance evolution? Are there concerns about information layering? Where do you see blind spots forming? When you ask well-placed questions, people reveal readiness without feeling pushed. The director didn't commit to anything, but he didn't dismiss the idea either. There's been informal discussion about improving direct visibility, he admitted. Nothing structured yet. That was all I needed. Readiness existed. Next, I strengthened the data case. I compiled 3 years of governance delays caused by interpretive filtering, not naming individuals, just structural inefficiencies, time lost between internal debate and board clarity, instances where strategic hesitation stemmed from misaligned summaries rather than factual disagreement. Numbers don't accuse, they illuminate. Meanwhile, beside me, nothing changed visibly. Claire continued her role fluidly. She still asked probing questions occasionally, still offered commentary upward, but I had reduced what she could access. Without raw material, her summaries became more general. Leadership interactions with me had already grown more direct over the past months. So when I began speaking slightly more assertively in formal sessions, citing external frameworks, referencing regulatory trends, it didn't feel abrupt. It felt prepared. One afternoon after a strategy review, Claire turned to me. "You've been very forward-thinking lately," she said carefully. "I've been reading more," I replied. She smiled, but her eyes lingered longer than usual. The proposal submission in itself was quiet. I sent it directly to the board governance committee chair, copying my manager for transparency. The subject line was neutral. Independent advisory framework, discussion draft. No dramatic language, no urgency. Inside, the document was meticulous. 23 pages. Executive summary, comparative benchmarking, risk analysis, implementation roadmap, cost-neutral integration plan, and at the end a single line. Willing to support pilot implementation if aligned with board objectives. Not, I request this role. Not, I propose myself. Just availability. Then I waited. This is the hardest part for most people. Waiting without signaling anxiety. For 2 weeks, there was no formal response. During that time, I behaved exactly the same. I attended meetings, drafted reports, collaborated normally. Claire seemed slightly unsettled. Not by anything specific, but by the absence of something. Data. She asked fewer interpretive questions now. Instead, she began offering more of her own analysis openly in meetings, as if compensating for the narrowing stream. Then, One Thursday afternoon, the governance committee chair requested a closed session with me. Not Claire. Not my manager. Me. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. He asked precise questions about implementation risk, executive pushback, and scalability. I answered calmly, referencing page numbers without looking flustered. At the end, he said something simple. This would change reporting dynamics. Yes, I replied. That's the intention. He nodded slowly. Give us time. When I returned to my desk, Claire looked up. You were gone a while. Committee discussion, I said lightly. About? Structural benchmarking. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't an explanation either. Silence once again was choice. And here's what mattered most. If the proposal advanced, it would subtly reduce the value of interpretive proximity, because governance strategy would no longer rely on corridor conversations. It would live in formal advisory channels. No confrontation required. No exposure necessary. Just evolution. Moving in silence doesn't mean hiding. It means allowing structure to do what emotion never could. And once the board began internal deliberations, the consequences were already forming, even if no one beside me could see them yet, especially not Claire. The first consequence didn't look like fallout. It looked like confusion. 2 weeks after my closed-door session with the governance committee chair, a calendar invite went out to senior leadership. Review, Governance Advisory Channel, Preliminary Discussion. Claire was not on the invite list. That alone shifted the air around our desks. She noticed before I did. Did you see this? She asked, turning her monitor slightly toward me. I did, I replied calmly. Her eyes scanned my face, searching for context. Where did this come from? She asked lightly, almost amused. Benchmarking discussions have been ongoing, I said, which was true. That meeting triggered something subtle across the executive floor. Directors began asking for raw governance inputs earlier in the process. Instead of waiting for consolidated summaries, they requested structured risk matrices directly from source teams. Interpretation layers started thinning. Not dramatically, incrementally. Claire felt it first. Her usual rhythm, collect informal perspectives, shape them, deliver synthesized insight, met friction. Directors began responding with, let's hear from Mia directly. Can governance provide their independent assessment? Can we separate operational view from structural risk? The language shifted. Independent, direct, separate. One afternoon, after a strategy call, Claire exhaled sharply. They're overcomplicating things, she said. We've always streamlined governance through executive summaries. Streamlining can blur distinctions, I replied evenly. She looked at me carefully. You think this new structure is necessary? I think clarity scales better than efficiency, I said. It wasn't a debate. It was a statement. What changed next wasn't loud either, but it was noticeable. Senior leaders began looping me into conversations earlier. Before Claire had time to contextualize them, an email would arrive. Mia, can you advise directly before we finalize positioning? Directly. The word repeated itself across weeks. Claire's role didn't disappear. She was still respected, still articulate, still visible. But something intangible had shifted. She was no longer the exclusive translator of governance psychology. Reliance diversified. And when reliance diversifies, influence redistributes. I watched the consequences unfold without commentary. In meetings, when she framed team hesitation, directors would now ask, has that been formally assessed? Can we document that concern? Documentation replaced interpretation. It wasn't personal. It was structural. One morning, she leaned toward me, voice softer than usual. Did you propose something to the board? She asked. I paused, not to strategize, but to choose precision. I submitted a benchmarking draft, I said. It's under review. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Why didn't you mention it? It was exploratory, I replied. No need to create noise prematurely. The silence between us held longer than it ever had before. For 3 years, she had been the bridge. Now the bridge was being audited. And when someone's value is built on translation, direct access feels destabilizing. But here's the important part. I never attacked her credibility. I never referenced past submissions. I never exposed patterns. The consequences weren't punishment. They were evolution. In the following board cycle, governance reports were presented under a new format, separating operational summaries from structural risk commentary. The advisory section carried my name, not prominently, just accurately. Claire still presented portions of operational alignment, but narrative authority had split. That split changed dynamics more than confrontation ever could. Because when power shifts quietly, people feel it before they understand it. She wasn't being sidelined. She was being balanced. And balance, to someone used to asymmetry, feels like loss. One afternoon, as we packed up for the day, she said something almost to herself. Things feel different lately. They are, I said gently. She looked at me searching. For you? For the structure, I replied. And that was the truth. Because the real consequence wasn't tension between us. It was that the system no longer required an interpreter. And when a system stops needing you in the way it once did, you either redefine your value or you confront what it was built on. The shift had begun, and it was only accelerating. The formal announcement came on a Monday morning. Subject line, Pilot Implementation, Independent Governance Advisory Channel. It wasn't dramatic, no celebratory tone, just structured language outlining a 6-month pilot where governance risk assessments would be submitted directly to the board committee before executive consolidation. At the bottom of the memo, advisory lead, interim, Mia Tran. I read it once, closed the email, took a slow breath. Across from me, Claire hadn't opened it yet. When she did, I watched the moment land. Her posture stiffened, not dramatically, just enough. She reread the memo twice. Then she turned to me. Your interim lead? Yes, I said calmly. How long has this been in motion? Several weeks, I replied. Her expression wasn't anger. It was recalculation. Because this wasn't a promotion in title alone. It was a redistribution of narrative authority. For 3 years, she had positioned herself as the lens through which leadership understood governance psychology. Now the board had institutionalized direct access. The bridge was no longer exclusive. Meetings changed almost immediately. In the first advisory session under the new structure, a director addressed me directly. Mia, separate from operational optimism. What structural risks concern you most? No preamble. No interpretation filter. Just the question. I answered clearly, referencing historical patterns, regulatory exposure, and governance blind spots. No hedging, no emotional tone. Afterward, one of the directors said something simple. This clarity is helpful. Clarity. That word again. Back at our desks, Claire's energy shifted subtly over the next few days. She spoke less in informal commentary. She volunteered more aggressively in operational meetings, as if reasserting visibility where she could. But the structural shift couldn't be undone. One afternoon, she asked for coffee. We hadn't done that in months. In the small cafe downstairs, she finally spoke plainly. You could have told me, she said. I didn't hide it, I replied. But you didn't involve me. I considered her carefully. For 3 years, I said gently. You've been comfortable interpreting my position upward. She went still. I've been representing team sentiment. I know, I said. The air between us wasn't hostile. It was exposed. I never tried to undermine you, she said quietly. I know, I repeated. And I meant it. That was the complicated truth. She hadn't tried to destroy me. She had optimized proximity. But now proximity no longer equaled leverage. She looked down at her coffee. This changes how leadership sees us. Yes, I said. Us? Governance, I clarified. She studied me, searching for accusation. There wasn't any, only finality. Because here's the thing about structural moves. Once implemented, they're almost impossible to reverse without admitting weakness. If leadership rolled back the advisory channel, it would signal fear of transparency. They wouldn't do that. The shift was permanent. Over the next quarter, something else became evident. Directors began seeking me out for strategic input beyond governance. Not because I was louder, because I was now positioned as independent. Claire remained competent, valuable, present. But the dynamic between us had changed irreversibly. She could no longer shape perception about me without me being in the room. And that realization, more than any confrontation, settled heavily. One evening as we packed up, she said softly, I didn't realize you felt contained. I paused. I wasn't contained, I said. I was quiet. She nodded slowly. And now? Now I'm deliberate. There was no apology exchanged. No emotional explosion. Just understanding. Because sometimes the hardest consequence isn't public fallout. It's realizing the system you built your advantage on no longer functions the same way. Too late to fix it. Too late to revert to old proximity. Too late to narrate someone who has begun narrating herself. And what surprised me most was this. I didn't feel victorious. I felt aligned. The tension between perception and reality had dissolved. Not through exposure, through elevation. The real confrontation didn't happen in the cafe. It happened 3 weeks later, in a glass conference room overlooking the city. The governance committee had invited both Claire and me to present parallel updates, operational alignment from her, structural advisory from me. It was the first time our roles would be visibly distinct in the same session. There was no hostility in the room, just clarity. Claire presented first. She was articulate, as always, confident. She outlined cross-department coordination, leadership sentiment, implementation pacing. Her delivery was polished. Then the chair turned to me. Mia, independent assessment? I began. I separated operational momentum from structural vulnerability. I highlighted areas where enthusiasm was masking oversight gaps. I referenced specific data points without emotional coloring. Halfway through, a director interrupted. Not critically, but curiously. Claire framed team confidence as high. You're suggesting conditional stability. Help us reconcile that. The room went still. 3 years ago, that question would have been answered indirectly, filtered, contextualized, softened. Now it was direct. I turned slightly toward Claire, not defensively, just acknowledging shared space. Both can be true, I said calmly. Operational teams can feel confident about execution, while structural risk remains under-examined. My role is to assess the latter. No contradiction, no exposure, just boundary. Claire met my gaze. There was no anger there, only recognition. After the meeting ended, we walked out together in silence. The hallway felt unusually bright. She spoke first. You've become very precise, she said. I've always been precise, I replied gently. She exhaled slowly. No, you've become untouchable. That word hung between us. Untouchable. It wasn't arrogance she was naming. It was independence. For 3 years, our proximity had blurred authorship. She could interpret my caution as hesitation, my analysis as emotional bias, my silence as compliance. Now nothing she said about me would stand without verification. Because I was in the room, that was the confrontation. Not a raised voice, not an accusation, just a structural reality she could no longer navigate around. We stopped near our desks. I never saw you as competition, she said quietly. I never saw you as threat, I answered. Both statements were true. The tension hadn't been personal. It had been architectural. She studied me carefully, as if trying to find the moment I had shifted. When did you decide to do this? I didn't decide to compete, I said. I decided to clarify. She nodded slowly, and I was in the way. You were the bridge, I corrected. The structure changed. That was as close to honesty as I was willing to go. There was no need to recount spreadsheets. No need to cite timestamps. No need to prove awareness. She already understood. The calmness unsettled her more than accusation ever could have. Because anger invites defense. Precision invites reflection. Over the next few days, our dynamic stabilized into something quieter, less casual, more respectful. She no longer probed for off-record opinions. I no longer withheld presence in strategic rooms. We worked side by side, no longer translator and subject, just two professionals with clearly defined domains. The confrontation without heat achieved something shouting never could. It reset equilibrium. And equilibrium, once established in visibility, is difficult to distort again. That afternoon, as I closed my notebook, I realized something simple. I hadn't defeated her. I had removed the need to defend myself. And sometimes, that is the most dominant position of all. It's been a year since the advisory channel became permanent. The title is no longer interim. The structure is no longer experimental. And the version of me that once sat quietly hoping to be interpreted correctly no longer exists. What changed most wasn't my role. It was my posture. For years, I believed restraint would protect me from misrepresentation. That if I stayed calm, factual, non-reactive, no one could distort my intentions. I was wrong. Silence without authorship invites narration. Now I still speak calmly, still choose words carefully, but I no longer assume that quiet competence will explain itself. I explain it, not defensively, directly. In meetings, I don't wait to be asked how I feel about structural shifts. I outline my framework proactively. I don't test unfinished thoughts beside one person and assume they'll remain contained. I bring formed perspectives into the room where decisions happen. There's a difference between being low drama and being low visibility. I used to confuse the two. Claire and I still work in the same department. Our conversations are professional, measured, occasionally even warm, but without the blurred intimacy of before. She's adapted in her own way, shifted toward operational leadership, where her strengths shine without relying on interpretive leverage. In some ways, I think the structural change clarified her value too. We were never enemies. We were participants in a system that rewarded proximity more than precision. Now the system rewards clarity, and I've grown into it. The emotional wound I carried, the fear of being misunderstood, doesn't dominate me anymore. It informs me. It reminds me that perception must be shaped intentionally, that influence isn't loud, it's consistent, that independence isn't isolation, it's access without mediation. People sometimes describe me differently now: strategic, decisive, authoritative. I smile when I hear those words, not because they flatter me, but because they aren't new traits. They were always there. They just weren't framed that way. The most surprising part of this entire experience is that I don't feel hardened. I don't feel suspicious. I don't scan rooms for hidden threats. I simply understand dynamics more clearly. If someone is studying you, learn what they're measuring. If someone is narrating you, step into the room where narration happens. If a structure limits your voice, redesign the structure, not the person. That's who I am now. Not louder, not colder, just deliberate. And when I sit at my desk, still carrying the same black leather notebook, I don't write about distortions anymore. I write about design, because the real shift wasn't exposing a colleague who reported my every move. It was realizing that I had the capacity to move beyond being reportable. And that quiet realization changed everything. When I look back on those 3 years, I don't see a villain. I see a system where proximity creates power, where interpretation quietly shapes identity, where silence, if unstructured, becomes editable. For a long time, I believed the story was about betrayal, about discovering that the colleague who sat beside me had been reporting my every move to senior management. But that's not the real story. The real story is about authorship. Claire didn't destroy my career. She didn't lie. She didn't sabotage me in some dramatic, cinematic way. She simply understood something I hadn't yet acted on. If you don't define yourself in rooms of power, someone else will define you for convenience. And convenience is rarely flattering. I used to think quiet strength meant endurance. Now I understand it means design. Designing how your voice enters a room. Designing how your work is framed. Designing structures that don't depend on interpretation. There's no revenge arc here. No public exposure, no triumphant takedown. Just a woman who realized she had allowed herself to be narrated and chose to step into the role of narrator instead. That's the quiet dominance no one teaches you about. Not dominance over people, dominance over positioning. If you're listening to this and recognizing something familiar, maybe a colleague who represents your thoughts too confidently, maybe feedback that sounds slightly misaligned with your intention, maybe the slow realization that your restraint is being mistaken for limitation. Pause. Don't explode, don't accuse, don't rush to correct the wrong person. Ask a different question. Where is the narrative being shaped, and how can you enter that room directly? Sometimes the most powerful move isn't confronting the spy. It's building a structure where spying becomes irrelevant. I don't sit beside Claire anymore. The department expanded, desks shifted, life moved forward. There's no tension now, no resentment, just clarity. And clarity, once earned, is something no one can quietly report away from you. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever realized that someone else was shaping how you were seen without you noticing it first? And if you did you confront them? Or did you redesign the system instead? I'd really like to know how you handled it.
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.